Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University. Welcome to Outrider 33. Would you supervise you? This outrider comes via request from James. I'm working with James at the moment. He's just finished his PhD, and we're working together to enable his career as a PhD supervisor. And through our conversations, as he's moving into his early career researcher phase, he asked me a fascinating question: who are the most difficult students that I've ever had to supervise? Now, I did answer that question for him, but I asked him, where did that question come from, James? And he said he'd been reflecting back on his own candidature, and he wondered if he would actually supervise himself with effectiveness. He's looking back on his 3 years of enrolment and realising things were perhaps not as they seemed as a student. So that's a very powerful and reflexive moment for James. But his question certainly provoked me, and I've been supervising PhD students for 25 years. I am that old. And obviously I've supervised hundreds of PhD students to completion, and as Dean, cared for thousands of PhD students and Master's students. So I know a great deal about the challenging cases. They have indeed been burned into my memory. But this personal opinion, this data set of one, is not terribly relevant. So I thought after our research in the last couple of weeks, looking at SOTL and looking at SOS, that I would take the Scholarship of Supervision on the road to answer James's question. So for this particular outrider, this is the research I did. The first thing I did was I wrote down myself the 10 most challenging student modes that I've had to supervise. Now, I wrote that on a card, and then I put that card away. I then contacted 20 of my mates, 20 of my great friends, very experienced supervisors, and I asked them, dude, what do you think were the most challenging students that you've supervised through your career? And then I finished off with two particular print-based data sets. I looked at ombudsman reports where supervisors complained about their students, and I also looked at the secondary literature, looked at the Scholarship of Supervision literature about complaints from supervisors about their students. So really interesting primary and secondary data set. Now, surprisingly, and this was a surprise, with all those different data sources, the overlap was about 70 to 75% of the configuration of the most challenging students. So if you're sitting at the moment and wondering, why is my supervisor not giving me feedback? Why is my supervisor cancelling meetings? Why is my supervisor not engaging with me? Why are they ghosting me? Or indeed, why have they made a decision to retire rather than finish my candidature? If these are questions that you're asking yourself, then there may be some answers in this outrider today. And can I say, just to present balance, I've just finished a book titled The Pernicious PhD Supervisor. I've gone in great detail and explored the very, very challenging modes and models of supervision that exists and supervisors that exist. So don't think for one moment I'm sort of laying this all on the students. I've certainly written a very, very long corrective to this outrider. But I wanted to make this outrider useful. We're reaching the end of our calendar year, and I wanted to ensure there was a moment of consciousness for you, that you're thinking about the decisions that you're making, that you are conscious about your behaviour and the patterns and the consequences of that behaviour. So we're looking this week at, the challenging students. Would you supervise you? Next week we're going to explore excuse culture, a very interesting new literature. But then we're doing all of this so in the new year we can sort of create a fantastic positive moment and look at rebooting your candidature. But before we get to any rebooting, we have to look at your present. We have to look at now. So if your supervisor is currently looking at you like they're Marlon Brando, and I mean late Marlon Brando, I may be about to give you some reasons for that behaviour. Okay, so would you supervise you or the 10 most challenging students to supervise? Let's do this. 1, the students that miss deadlines. Supervisors have many, many students and many, many deadlines and responsibilities. And if you miss one of those deadlines, that has consequences on the rest of their personal and professional life. So while a lot of the research literature quite rightly focuses on supervisors not providing quote unquote timely feedback to students, the greatest problem that I've confronted in my supervisory career, particularly in the last 10 years, is students missing deadlines. And missing deadlines not by an hour, not by a day, but by months. So I always ask students to help them plan. When will this chapter be completed? And I put that date that they have given me on my calendar, and I make sure that work exists around that particular date. So I'm aware that big job is coming, and I plan for it a month, 2 months, 3 months in advance. Then, of course, the work doesn't arrive. Doesn't arrive for weeks, doesn't arrive for months. And let me give you an example of the consequences of this. So a student told me that they would be giving me the full draft of their thesis on September 15 in a particular year. Now, those of us that work in graduate education, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, the last quarter of the year is catastrophic. It is our busy period where scholarships and so forth are organised and most of our students are finishing. So therefore we need to plan carefully. So okay, I was going to get this full draft on September 15 and then I would enact my 10 cycles of drafts so the student could submit before Christmas. Brilliant, winning, we can do this. The only problem was the student didn't submit the draft on September 15, but submitted the draft on December 24, Christmas Eve. No really email, no explanation, nothing at all. Here is the draft, December 24. So I heard nothing from the student at all except sending the full draft on Christmas Eve until 6 a.m. on December 26, when she sent a public tweet asking me when I will be returning her draft to her. Now, of course, December 26, Boxing Day, but also, can I say, Jamie Quinton, my wonderful husband, Jamie Quinton's birthday. So when I got that tweet, I cancelled the day completely, poor Jamie, and sat and I read the entire draft and I returned it to the student on December 27. So I did the work and I did the remaining 9 drafts, but I was pretty angry. And all these years later, I've remained pretty angry. So when you miss a deadline, it has cascading consequences on your supervisor's life. So if you ask yourself, why is my supervisor not providing me timely feedback? Ask yourself, is that because you did not provide a timely draft? Supervisors have a plan, and that supervisory plan collapses if you don't deliver the draft when you say you're going to deliver that draft. And this problem only intensifies when you deliver that work late and then expect a rapid turnaround. Okay, 2, students who do not read enough. These students who don't read enough begin the program in trouble and they continue their entire candidature in trouble. They don't know what they don't know, and really they don't know what they know. They're claiming a significant original contribution to knowledge, a SOC, because they haven't read enough to actually realise what they've supposedly created or invented or discovered was actually created, invented or discovered 35 years ago. So supervisors, when we're managing students like this, have to continue to what I call salami slice the topic. We have to create a very, very, very hair thin area of expertise, tiny, tiny, tiny area of expertise, so the student can at least demonstrate some coverage of the field. The other problem occurs when students think that they're incredibly interesting and that they can, through a data set of one, that is themselves, write a thesis. And they think that their personal experience is actually knowledge. Now, the data set of one, you, that's not the foundation of a PhD. Now, it can be enlivened through standpoint theory or positionality theory, but you've got to have done the reading, which is now a huge reading on positionality or standpoint theory. So if students do not do the reading of the scope and the scale that is required, then supervisors have to plug the gaps, and they have to reduce the level of reading that they recommend to students. They have to reduce the scope and scale of the thesis. They have to reduce the generalisability. So that's when supervisors end up suggesting to students that the thesis becomes a case study. The moment that a case study is being submitted as a PhD, I know what's happened here. So these are truly frightening theses to supervise, because they end up very, very small and very, very narrow, and they're very difficult to get through examination. So supervisors cross their fingers, cross their toes, and hope that there is enough content there. So you know you're in a bit of a challenging situation when supervisors just about every week have to suggest readings to you, and that's because they're increasingly desperate and they're increasingly frightened for you. So a lack of reading manifests into an overclaiming of originality and significance. If you haven't read enough, then you think you've invented all these ideas that actually were invented when the Bee Gees were in the charts the first time. You don't know that because you haven't read enough. So your supervisor is trying to mitigate and manage your language, your generalisations, to stop you overclaiming. Now, in my fields, this is often a theoretical problem, and students use words like deconstruction or critical discourse analysis, my goodness me, where they actually have no idea what those words and terms and phrases actually mean. They mean analysis and description. So it's not deconstruction. All you're doing is a pretty basic analysis. Deconstruction is something very, very specific. So what we try and do is ask for ontological clarity. Right. 3, asking your supervisor to work harder than you are working. Now, one of the supervisors I spoke to used an unbelievable phrase with me. He stated, quote, "I've put too many of my words into this thesis," end of quote. Whenever you get really experienced supervisors together, successful supervisors who have got a lot of students through quickly, whenever you get these supervisors together, we talk about one particular type or group of students. And that is the students that we are frightened that we did too much for them. We shake our heads, we're embarrassed, we regret the scale of the work that we did for them. And there are lots of causes for this particular problem. Firstly, obviously, the student may be lazy, absolutely. They may be too busy, or they may be quote unquote entitled. Now that's a word I don't use. You've probably never heard me use that word entitled, but the crew I talked to used the entitled student a lot when they were talking with me. So what I think they were meaning when I asked them, what do you mean by entitled? The student expects the supervisor to do the reading for them, to write the thesis for them, to make it complete. And it reaches a point where the supervisor asks, whose thesis is this? The most dangerous group of students are the ones who think that they're doing the work and actually the supervisor is doing the work for them. So the supervisor is doing all this work and it sort of melts into the student's thesis like butter in a pan. These are incredibly sad cases, and often, the student is incredibly busy. I understand that, and to be frank, they're probably too busy to enrol in a doctorate, and sometimes the student is just lazy. They just can't be bothered. But every now and again, probably 1 in 10, 1 in 20 students I supervise, it is very clear that the supervisor is working so much harder than the student. The student only works during the supervisory meetings, so the only time they actually do any thinking or working is during the meeting itself. Little reading is done, basic writing is done, and at a certain point for all these supervisors, it becomes an ethical matter. Whose thesis is it? And at that point, that's when many of these supervisors step away from their particular behaviour. And they're doing it to see if the student can actually work at the standard required for a doctorate. And often the student can't, and the candidature ends. This behaviour infuriated the supervisors that I talked with. As I said, they use that word entitled, which is interesting. So supervisors endlessly offering comments, reading, altering the draft to an incredible degree. And then further, this was the other issue that was raised, the tracked changes were ignored and the same errors keep being presented in draft after draft after draft. The time wasted from these supervisors making the same corrections through all of these drafts means that these supervisors stop reading the drafts. This problem intensifies when you present the drafts with spelling and grammatical errors. Now, let me tell you what this is like. This happens to me a lot. So a student presents me with a draft, and this has only happened in the last 10 years, by the way. Student presents me with a draft, 100,000 words, and they haven't put a spelling checker through 100,000 words. So I have to do that first, and that takes me about an hour, sometimes longer. So think about it. I'm trying to offer you feedback about epistemology, about theory, about ontology, and I'm having to correct your spelling. If you haven't done a spelling check, that wears down supervisors. Think about all the things we could be doing. I can write about 5,000 words an hour, right? But instead of doing that work, I'm putting your draft through a spelling checker. So if you're getting some attitude from your supervisor, I'm sorry about that, but ask yourself about what you're doing. Have you presented drafts to them where they are having to do spelling and grammatical checks? And it's interesting, I hear students say, well, I gave the draft to my supervisor and all he found were sort of writing errors and spelling and grammar. You're not asking the question, why have you presented a draft to a supervisor with spelling errors? If you send a thesis to an examiner with spelling errors, they will send it back to the university. That's why we do the basic corrections first. Okay, 4. You disappear for weeks, for months, and then you expect immediate feedback. This happens a lot. A student disappears. Now, they may disappear because of a health concern or a family concern. They may disappear because of work. They may go on a holiday. But they disappear. Sometimes they tell their supervisors that they're disappearing, sometimes they don't. But I'm always interested with what happens upon the return of the student, because often when the student returns, all these deadlines suddenly cascade on them and milestones are required and on we go. So the student realises they're behind in the milestone and they then need immediate feedback. The best way to receive feedback from your supervisor is little and often. And that's why I get my students right from the very start of their candidature to write what I call 1,000-word discussion papers. Has a lot of advantages, gets the students writing from the start, and I'm able to draft little and often and create that iterative improvement. But if your student receives nothing and then has to do a huge amount of drafting, they often become overwhelmed. So little and often is the way forward. 5, this was a new one for me, the crowdsourcing student. This is the student who talks with everyone, spends a lot of time in coffee shops, spends a lot of time talking with people on social media. And what they're doing is they're gathering up opinions about their research. Now, all these opinions are granted equal weight. So their supervisor's expertise is one of many voices that are granted credibility in this process. Now, the reason supposedly students are getting all these opinions about their research is so they can cherry pick their responses. So these are the talkers rather than the readers, and they're highly underprepared. So when supervisors tell them that they need to do more work, they need more data sets, they need more stuff, that supervisory judgment is treated as an opinion, and it's ignored as they continue to talk with people who agree with them. Fascinating. 6, students that violate professional and personal boundaries. This is the group where students confuse professional guidance about a doctorate with personal intimacy. These are the students that have restraining orders against them, wait for their supervisor in car parks, park outside their home. And they want a relationship to remain after the thesis has been submitted. And I've certainly had a few of these situations through my career, men and women, can I say? And because of all of that, as you know, I now maintain absolutely rigid differentiation between my working life and my private life. Absolutely rigid. I don't have coffee with students. I don't see any students at any time outside of my office. I don't blur roles or functions in life anymore, and I haven't really for 25 years, and I've tightened it up to the point where now it's absolutely rigid, because a supervisor is a supervisor. We have our own lives. You are a professional responsibility. You are not a friend. Friendship may come later, but it will be much later. You are a professional responsibility. 7, closed-minded students. Again, this was another surprise for me, closed-minded students. And this challenging student particularly came from my colleagues in the sciences. Students assuming that they know what they're doing and they will not take advice. And these students are particularly dangerous when there are industry partners involved in the thesis. And therefore, because it's an industry project, it requires clear inputs and clear outputs and very precise dissemination protocols. So what happens is the student stops listening to the supervisor and they burn through the industry partnership. They have not produced the research of sufficient quality or scope or scale to move through examination. So these students present to the world as hyper-confident. They're hyper-confident, but they are confrontational, they're oppositional, and they're also apathetic. And they don't take on any advice or commentary. Okay, let's go to 8. Students that don't want to do the work. So this is the particular group of students that are terribly interested in being a PhD student, but not prepared to do the really tough and constant work that's necessary to reach deadlines and indeed enact their milestones. One of my colleagues talked about a young guy that loved being a PhD student. He loved being a PhD student, but he spent the bulk of the first year of his candidature drinking coffee and playing frisbee. So at this point, when he had to do a milestone, it was completely humiliating for him and he left the program. 9, reactive rather than proactive students. Students want the supervisor to take responsibility for their project and endlessly suggesting literature. So this was interesting in my research. I'd never thought about this, colleagues, if I'm honest with you, that when students are, quote, wanting feedback, that's code for wanting the supervisor to do the work. Now, of course, that's not the case. You must have feedback, incredibly important. But just ask yourself what you mean by the word feedback and be very clear about that, because clearly some students use the word feedback to say, I want my supervisor to do more work on my thesis for me. So no research happens in these theses that is not suggested by the supervisor. These students, of course, may be distracted by life, and also this was particularly described as a characteristic of younger students who are looking at their colleagues, looking at their mates from school and from undergraduate years who are getting married, getting mortgages, getting on with their life, and they're wondering why they're doing the PhD. And they're not really committing to the PhD because they're endlessly thinking about what else they could be doing with their lives. So that's where we start to see the reactive student asking the supervisor, what do I need to do next? What do I need to do next? What do I need to do next? So colour by numbers, PhD, right? Won't work. 10, students with extraordinary expectations. Now, I understand and I acknowledge, and I'm so sorry that many of you are waiting days, weeks, months for feedback from your supervisors. I'm really sorry about that. But sometimes, and I think some of you know this, you might have extraordinary expectations on your supervisors. This has happened so frequently in my supervisory career that's funny, but I also blame myself. I must be doing something wrong that I particularly attract this group of students. Indeed, students on a pretty regular basis send me full drafts at 7 p.m, 8 p.m, 10 p.m, 1 a.m. in the morning for a meeting the following day. And even more sadly, really, they're horrified or disappointed and occasionally disgusted that if I've got a draft at 1 a.m. in the morning, that I haven't read it by their meeting at 10 a.m. Because as that particular student described, Tara, you get up at 1 a.m, so I thought I'd send the draft so you could look at it when you wake up. Okay. Now, supervision is not a hotel dry cleaning service that you drop off your clothes, you have a nice day shopping, and you come back and your clothes are beautifully pressed and laying on the bed. Supervision is not like that. Never, please, never, never, never give your supervisor a draft the day before you expect feedback. We don't have the flexibility to read it. We may have 20 years ago, but we don't have that flexibility now. Remember, academics now are overscheduled. Most of us do our actual work outside of the workplace because the working day is filled with meetings, right? So we have a list of tasks to complete every night. Most of you have seen me when I'm walking back to my car. These days I often have 2 trips back to the car with a box and my bag full for work I have to do overnight. And I work all weekend. I mean, seriously, all weekend. I couldn't do a job like this if I didn't work all weekend. Now, many academics are similar. This has been studied quite extensively in the United Kingdom, and academics are working 60+ hour weeks every single week. So I understand you want leisure time, and you have a right to leisure time. We can't continue this type of culture because academics are going to die. They're going to die. So I understand that you want leisure time, and that's important. But sometimes remember, your supervisor is also a human being, and maybe they want to spend time with their family, and maybe they want to do something nice like walk through the botanical gardens, look at the flowers, watch the sunrise. And the thing is, they'll be better supervisors if occasionally you let them have that weekend and let them maybe finish some of their own research and their own writing and their own work. So just for me, monitor your expectations. Are you expecting, really, even implicitly, that your supervisor will work all weekend to return that draft to you? Please remember that supervisors are human. We are people. Now, I know this has been quite a depressing outrider, I know, but it is important, I think, that at least once a year, all of us have this moment where we reflect on who we are and we reflect on our expectations of other people, and we start to exfoliate those relationships. So next week, we look at the consequences of an excuse culture, the role of excuses in a doctoral program. And then, of course, we hit the much more positive reboot, the rebooting of your thesis after that for the new year. But let's this week have a think about how you use time and your expectations about how other people use their time. And we start to come to our supervisory spaces with motivation and kindness and compassion. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.